Mulberries are one of my favorite plants in the world because they require almost no maintenance. They grow in almost every climate. They produce prolific amount of berries, and the leaves are actually high in protein. This is a brand new presentation I created. First time I'm giving it. I gave it to myself earlier today, and it was with lots of positive feedback so far. But the challenge with any intro to permaculture presentation is actually trying to figure out what to include and what not to include, because permaculture is very, very information intensive. So this is the intro to permaculture. This is basically what I'm using for this presentation. This is a deconstructed designer's manual. So there's a full certificate course, and this is basically the textbook. So for this presentation, I'm going to do about this much of this book. And like you could do about a 2-day course of just the intro book. And then the full certificate course is a 72-hour, generally over 12 days if it's in person. So it's a lot of information. And what my hope is we can do more presentations that are permaculture specific and kind of like build on this one. So I trying to focus on the main principles, because really describing permaculture can be a challenge because it's not one thing. It's like a system of connections and principles. So my intention is that after you learn these principles, you will be able to see how permaculture can be applied globally in all climates, cultures, and geographies, and in not just living systems, but all facets of our life. So before we get started, I just want to have a little story about some of my beginnings in permaculture and most of my permaculture experiences in aid projects. And one of my first introductions to permaculture was I was in Australia studying with Jeff Lawton, who's basically the world expert in permaculture. He's got a farm and demonstration site in Australia, and he let me tag along to him to a project in northern Vietnam. So I was in the mountains on a project in northern Vietnam, and then he got a call for a consultation in China for a sustainable chicken farm. And so we flew from the mountains of Vietnam to a boardroom in Hong Kong, driving around mainland China, looking at a few different sites. So that was my first introduction. A year later, I went and managed the project in Jordan, the Greening the Desert project, that was 2009, and it basically looked like Mars. It was literally just gray dust and really hardy, spiky desert trees, and you were just glad that anything would grow. And in those conditions, which gave me the foundation for everything I do now, is you basically don't want to try anything fancy. You want to make sure everything you do is completely bomb-proof, because it is one of the harshest, most water-stressed areas in the world. A few years later, almost the complete opposite scenario from a climate standpoint. I was in a project in Vanuatu, like probably one of the most primitive places I've ever been in my life, like literally dirt floors and tin shacks with an active volcano. So you had little micro earthquakes like all the time, and then volcanic ash in the sky. So every time it rained, it was like, for the first couple of days, I was like, why does my eyes sting every time it rains? And I was like, oh, the volcano. If you ever want the craziest experience in your life, go to the island of Tanna in Vanuatu, and you can literally walk right up to the crater of the volcano and stare down into the molten lava with blasting rocks coming up. And every time it blasted, I would hit the deck like for cover, and the locals were just sitting there taking selfies and laughing at me. You could literally grow anything you want. I mean, if you just drop seeds out of your pocket, it would sprout into a food forest. I mean, they're like 2 feet of topsoil. But what they didn't know how to do is stay in one place and retain the fertility. They would literally walk 15 minutes into the jungle, hack out an area of the bush, grow their annual veggies, and then when the fertility was depleted, they would move on and do it again. But they were running out of room because the population was increasing. So they couldn't just keep hacking out a new garden out of the bush. So what we were setting up was for a primary school to actually have a farm on site that provided their food, and we needed to show them how to actually cycle fertility in one place and keep, so like composting was like completely foreign concept. Fencing was like they didn't do fence. The craziest thing I've ever seen, they literally had cows tethered in one spot, no water, but yet there must have been enough moisture in the morning that they would get enough water by like eating the grass that was covered in dew. But I mean, the animals looked healthy, but they would just like stick a stake in the ground, tie the cow to the rope, and then every now and then the cow would break free and just be running wild. And then of course it would end up in the garden. So I spent 3 weeks just trying to get the jankiest chicken wire you ever seen in your life to keep the chickens out so we could actually plant vegetables. But anyway, I say all that because it just demonstrates that permaculture can be applied anywhere in the craziest places, and you never know where it will take you. So let's get into it. This is Bill Mollison. He is the founder of Permaculture, and actually the anniversary of his passing was yesterday. And he led a very colorful life, and he was a very colorful character, but he created permaculture because in the 70s, where kind of like the protest movement started, he quickly realized that protesting what we didn't want wasn't achieving anything. So he decided to create a system to demonstrate what we actually wanted. And I would say, I don't think protesting what we don't want is achieving much these days either. So that's a big part of the reason for creating this group, is to demonstrate what it is we actually want to see in our communities. And the word permaculture itself is a combination of permanent and agriculture, and really what it means is permanence and culture, because you can't have a permanent culture without a sustainable food and land use system. And every time, I've kind of just centered on this definition now, but when the first few years of permaculture, every time someone asked me what's permaculture, I'd have a different definition every time. And depending on who you're talking to, you might have a different definition. So it's really hard to have a succinct like elevator pitch for what permaculture is. And what it does is it just naturally leads to more conversation. So this is what I like, but there's a lot to unpack in this definition. So it's an ethical design science for creating sustainable human environments. So it's based in ethics, which separates it from most other sciences and disciplines. And it's a design science, which if you're not familiar with that term, it's basically a scientific, rational, or systemic application of design itself, popularized by Buckminster Fuller, who is the creator of the geodesic dome, amongst other really interesting inventions. And so we're talking about sustainability. That word kind of has been co-opted and lost meaning through marketing and advertising. So for our purposes, we need a clear definition of what it means to be sustainable. And really what it is an energy equation. So a sustainable system needs to produce more energy than it consumes, but going further, enough in surplus to maintain and replace itself over its lifetime. So you literally you can't just tread water and be sustainable. You actually need to produce a surplus just to be able to maintain and replace something. So if we're talking about regenerative, that means you need to go even further. And it's really, like I said, an energy equation, and it's the most equitable way to compare any two systems. Actually, Bill Mollison said we should give everything a kilowatt hour value, and then that would be the most equitable way to compare anything. So if you said, well, I got a jar of cinnamon and I got a bag of M&Ms, like, okay, well, that M&Ms is this kilowatt, it costs this much energy to create that bag of M&Ms versus the cinnamon. And what that really would show is how important it is to have natural biological systems using the sun to produce their energy versus lots of machines and factories. And so our current economy doesn't account for the actual energy used to create things. And onto the ethics. The ethics are very simple, but I think they're very profound, and it's really like a perspective on how we approach the planet. So first and foremost is earth care. So everything on the planet is an expression of life, and we are a part of that. I think part of the problem that we see in the world is that we think humans are separate. There's obviously, perspective that humans are superior, but definitely it's like, okay, this is for nature and then this is for humans. And what we aim to do is integrate it all and actually be a net positive for the planet itself. But we are a people-centered design system, and people care, I always say, starts with self-care. So you're no good to your community if you're running yourself into the ground. And the analogy I like to use is the oxygen mask on the airplane, where they always tell you, you must put your own oxygen mask on first, so you can't help somebody else if you're suffocating. So the same way, the best way to be a benefit to your community is to create a surplus that you can share. And also, people care means not exploiting people. Like, you can have an organic farm, but you're exploiting people, but you're still certified organic. So there's an inherent duty in how we design systems that we're not just going back to, feudal serf systems of the Middle Ages and drudgery. And so through design and through the right placement of elements, we can make more efficient systems. And then last and most important, to be sustainable, we need a surplus, and that surplus needs to be reinvested into earth care and people care. Now, I don't know if you've noticed, but we got a few problems out there. Now, everybody wants your attention for what's the most important problem, and there's no shortage of bad news. And it was true in the 80s when Bill Mollison wrote the designer's manual, and it's still true today. We don't need any more evidence of the need to act. And it doesn't seem that flooding people with negative evidence of all the problems is inspiring to do anything at all. I think most people are just numb at this point, and they just want to stick their head in the ground and not think about it. So there are, from our perspective, 3 critical problems that if we don't solve, then we're going to not have a planet to live on. And number 1 by far is soil erosion. And industrially, in most of the world, we don't have an answer to all the soil that's eroding. And most of that soil erosion is caused by industrial agriculture and how we supply our needs, which inevitably leads to the next problem of deforestation. So we're removing ecosystems to plant annual crops, which then leads to more soil erosion and then leads to more chaotic climate, because ecosystems major in forests, and forests help buffer the climate. And then last and not insignificant, but still an issue, is pollution. So it's accurate to say that everything in the planet is natural in a sense, is that it originated from the planet, but we just tend to put things in very unnatural arrangements, and they can take a lot more than a human lifetime to get processed. So that's really, obviously the natural world is very adaptive and very amazing. They keep finding things that are trying to solve our own problems, like mushrooms cleaning up nuclear waste in Chernobyl, organisms eating plastic. But if we're overstressing the environment, then it can't, and there's too much for it to process, then it can't do both. So the more we can alleviate the problem and create more ecosystems and more help for the planet, all the kind of weird things that we're doing can eventually be sorted out. And this permaculture also has basically a duty of care or a general personal responsibility. So it's not like an uncaring, pull yourself up by your bootstraps type of thing. We're all about helping community, but we need to create a surplus so then we can help community. And so I think we should all participate in local food production on some level. Doesn't mean we all have to be farmers or all have to be gardeners, but you could get your produce directly from someone who's growing it responsibly, or you can volunteer or help on that farm. And yeah, it starts with us. There's no magical Superman who's going to save us. We need to be the ones to figure out basically our own existence. And more importantly, figuring out what we need to do as a community and doing it together. We're social creatures and we need human interaction, and nobody can do it by themselves. So now we're on to the principles, and permaculture is mostly it's a system of connections and putting things in the right relationship to make an extra benefit. And sorry, I made a labyrinth for you. And as I said in my lovely little story, is that these principles can be applied anywhere. And then once you get into like actual techniques, that's where climate, geography, rainfall, all those things, culture matters with technique, but principles are fairly universal. And the first one is relative location. So the core of permaculture is design, and design is about connections. So it's not so important about the chicken, the tree, or the water, but how the chicken, tree, and the water connect and what their relationship is. So permaculture can make that connection, and then eventually you can feed the chicken from the tree. And also permaculture connects disciplines. So permaculture is not any one discipline, it's not any one technique. You could think of it as a wardrobe or a toolbox where other disciplines fit inside it. So organic gardening, agroforestry, biodynamics, aquaculture, all these things can fit inside a permaculture system. And then it's up to the designer to decide which one is the most appropriate for the application. And also, all those systems can supply our needs from a food and wildlife perspective, but they're not going to have how to create a community group, how to do financial and legal structures. So a big part of permaculture is the economics and the financial and the legal structures, what we call like invisible structures. And that's sometimes more important to actually make a viable growing system is, okay, in this still money-driven world, can you make it work? And there is no singular use item in nature, and we want to find as many items that can have multifunction. So a tree is not just shade, it can also provide fruit. It can also potentially add fertilizer to the soil. It has a nitrogen-fixing nodules on its roots. Or also a chicken, it's not just for eggs, not just for meat. It can also get rid of the pests in your garden. It can use fertilizer in its manure. And if you have the chicken tractor on steroids system, it can make the best compost on the planet. So it's all about designing and right relationship. And we're all about redundancy. As the saying goes, 2 is 1 and 1 is none. So we need backups on backups on backups, particularly for anything critical importance. So water, heat, cooling, food. You should have 3 to 5 ways of providing that function. So for water, you could have city water, you could have a well, you could have rainwater tanks, and you can have ponds on the property. With a little bit of natural filtration, you can drink pond water. So it's a pretty big, it's the cheapest storage of water is in earthen dams, whereas constructed rainwater tanks, whether concrete or plastic, can get pretty expensive. But a little story about the importance of multiple water systems. So when I was living in Texas, the winter, we had 3 days of below freezing in a row, which it's not unusual for it to freeze. This is in Dallas, but it's unusual for it to stay below freezing for 3 straight days. So of course, none of the irrigation, none of the plumbing, most of the infrastructure is designed for 3 days of freezing weather. So all the water out to the pasture was frozen. And this was like the classic mistake of too many animals on too small a property. So this was an unusually large 5-acre property in an affluent suburb, but it had about 3 acres of pasture, which had 4 dairy goats, 3 mini donkeys, and 7 black Angus beef cows, 3 of which were bulls, and they were some big boys. Very well behaved, but just ridiculous. And so completely overgrazed. So when it froze, so the water pipe out to the stock tanks where they drank their water was frozen. The stock tanks were frozen solid. But thankfully there was a swimming pool. So I got a couple 55-gallon barrels in the back of the 4x4, and that's had multiple trips for 3 days to go and pour water into the frozen stock tanks. But without that swimming pool, it would have been trying to fill up a 55-gallon drum from the faucet in the kitchen would have taken half the day. So redundancies and backups. So kind of the core of permaculture design and how we make energy efficiency is through zone planning and sector planning. So zones is all about how many times you need to visit something per day or per year. And it's zones 1 through 5. Zone 1 being immediately around the house or the main point of action. Some people will say zone 0 is inside the house, or some people say zone 0 is in your brain, but that's really zone 1 is most important. And that's where, things you have to visit multiple times a day are going to be located. More intensive managed systems. You can have some fruit trees, but generally they're going to be kind of dwarf size. And then zone 2 and zone 3, 4, it gets more wild, less managed, less intense. And zone 3 is kind of where you would start to have your grazing cells. You can have alleyways that go in. So you could have, say if you had a dairy cow, which lives out in zone 3, when it's milking time, you could have a path that brings it right into zone 1, so you don't have to walk out there. So and then zone 5 is basically wilderness, where you're not really designing anything. You're mostly going there to gather surplus material or just for observation and education. And so in a typical suburb or urban, you're definitely gonna have zone 1. You might have zone 2, depending on how big or how funky your yard is. And you might have like an expression of zone 5, like you could have a corner that's like unkempt or like a little wild area. And then sectors are the energies coming in and out of your site. So things like the sun, you're going to factor in sun angle. So winter and summer have 2 completely different angles of the sun, and that's going to affect your placement of things, and particularly building design, winds, water, bad smells, bad views. All these things are energies that are coming onto your site, and you can design your system to either accept them and use them, or block them or deflect them. And so it's all about using the energy to your advantage. As much as possible, we like to use biological resources because they're the most renewable and the most, particularly in a small scale system. But there are and they can kind of build on each other. Like if you're growing timber to eventually build a house with, yes, it's going to be like, maybe 10 to 20 year time frame depending on the species you're growing, but you also can get a product or mulch or compost material while the trees are growing. Whereas machinery and non-natural materials can be very useful. Obviously, trying to create natural irrigation pipe is going to be a tall order. I mean, you technically could do it out of bamboo, but you're definitely not getting drip irrigation very efficiently from trying to replicate plastic. But what you can do is, if you wanted to use plastic in the beginning, it can be a very good way to speed up establishment of systems. And then through soil creation and design and other water harvesting, you could eventually get your perennial systems like trees and bushes off of daily drip irrigation. Or as far as using machinery, like a big earth moving machine, there's a lot of advantage to digging a pond with an excavator, that if the pond's going to live over 500 years. So the energy of that machine is definitely going to be well paid off for the energy that that pond would create. So there's a lot of people who get very like myopic and everything's got to be natural. I'm only going to use hand tools. And it's like, okay, I'll see you in 20 years when you're still trying to, grow a garden. So it's all about energy, and how you're using that appropriate techniques. Like you could get 1,000 people to do the work of a 25-ton excavator, but good luck organizing 1,000 people in America to do anything. And you got to feed them, and you got to house them. So a bit of diesel fuel to build some really long-lasting systems is well worth it. So you're going to get tired of me saying energy and cycling and connections, but that's really the heart of the permaculture principles. And so we want to, as much as possible, capture all the energy coming onto the site and use it as many times, and ideally in its most high value state. So it's not how many gallons of water you're capturing, it's how many times you use it. So 1,000 gallons of water used 5 times before it leaves the site, or you can't use it anymore, is the equivalent of 5,000 gallons of water. So if you're capturing rainwater, you can use it for drinking water, for shower, for the sink. Then that gray water can be used to go to the garden, or particularly bananas are a great thing to send your washing machine laundry water to, because it needs a fair bit of water to begin with, but it just can absorb all those extra nutrients in the soap. And really that soap is like mostly phosphorus nutrient anyway. Scale is one of the big factors of what causes problems. Most of our food systems particularly are industrial scale, and all the inefficiencies and exploitation that come along with growing something far away and then transporting it to where people are. So and small scale systems are actually more productive per square foot. So if you took the production you could get in a small suburban lot and put that over like an industrial size, it would be ridiculous. But obviously you can't do it over that largest size, because it's the attention that you can give to a small system is why it's more productive, why you can fit more really densely packed species into a small system, because you're always there, you're always making adjustments. Whereas once you get too big, it just gets oversimplified and inefficient. And so one of the biggest changes I believe we need to make is to return most of our food production to where we live. And if we there's no question that there's so much unused land. And if we were way more efficient with how we produce our food, then most of the polluting industrial agriculture that's out there could be returned to wilderness. which would be a much more positive effect to the biosphere than what's currently happening. So humans have the unique ability to choose how they behave, whereas all other creatures on the planet more or less can just be what they are. Like a fox can't wake up and decide to be a beaver one day, and vice versa. So humans have the choice of how we behave, and we can use the right techniques and principles to enhance soil creation and enhance succession. So you can take a really degraded, barren landscape, say like a housing development that got abandoned. So the first thing what they do is they scrape all the topsoil and weeds away, and they're left with subsoil. And what's going to grow in subsoil? Some of the really hardy, if anything, really hardy, spiky, unpleasant weeds. And so we always see that as a problem, and we want to get rid of the weeds, but the weeds are actually trying to solve a problem. They're trying to condition the soil, trying to add organic matter, so then the next succession of more sophisticated species can come in. So we can use that process to our advantage. So we can stack in the beginning a system full of what a lot of people would call invasives or weedy species. But if you have the management and the time perspective of what eventually it's going to be, like weedy species don't have a place in a really rich, fertile garden because they don't have a purpose to be there anymore. So they're not going to take over. Whereas most weeds that come up in your really rich vegetable garden, they're really easy to pop out if you get any at all. Whereas if you have a really hard-packed, poor soil, is a lot of times where the weeds are going to germinate because the conditions for them to germinate are what's happening there. And so we can, in a time stacking manner, you can say like the early stage of a food forest, you can have all the 7 layers of a food forest, so your overstory, your understory, your shrub layer, your herbaceous, your ground cover, your rhizome, your vine layer. You can put all that in at the beginning, and you can add in annual veggies because everything's going to be small and everything's going to take a few years before they get up and actually shade things. So you can be harvesting annual crops while you're building your perennial systems. And then once the perennial systems take over, you're going to have less work, but you're going to get more production. So that's the advantage of, say, like shrubs, trees, fruit trees, is in the beginning, there's a bit more work to establish, but once they're established, they need less care, but their production goes up. And that's what this July convinced me, is that I'm reducing my annuals and I'm just going more perennials. Because they're also, once they're established, they're more adaptable to changes in climates, whereas even annuals that you save the seed yourself, and every time you save seed from something you grow yourself, they can get more adapted to the climate. But every year, if it's chaotic, it's hot, it's cold, it's too dry, the annuals can suffer more than, and you have a whole slew of perennials that fruit at different times, they can be more adaptable. We tend to be diversity freaks in permaculture. I think Eric Tonesmeyer, who wrote the Permaculture Plants book, he's had a demonstration site in Massachusetts. I think he started with 300 plants, like all mostly perennials, and he reduced it down to 200 in like maybe 1/10 of an acre. So that's like just diversity stacking to the T. But really, it's not just throwing out a bunch of crazy random things. It's the connections, it's the functional connections to elements that make stability. So if you just litter your site with all kinds of crazy different plants, it's going to just naturally simplify. But it's really finding the connections that lead to stability and security. So if any one thing goes out, you have 3 or 5 other things that you can still use. Like there's a saying about a fishing net, it can lose 80% of its connections and still functionally catch fish. So that's kind of how, if you think about it in that way, so we get all these little connections and all these different things going. So if there's a bad year or something it's too wet, it's too dry, there's a pest explosion, the more things you have, the more likely you're going to actually still be able to feed yourself. Whereas singular monocrop industrial agriculture, it's like 1,000 acres of corn. Okay, it's a bad year for corn, they have nothing else. And that's not something most people can recover from. So, but also it's having a polyculture system of multiple things naturally is very difficult to mechanize. And so it naturally is a different scale of operation and bringing the human element back into it, which not everybody wants to be involved that directly with food production, but I don't really see how we can continue with 1,000-acre monocrop farms, given what they're doing to the soil as it is. Life happens on the edge. So edges are where two medium meet or two ecosystems meet. So where the forest meets the prairie, you're going to have an edge of kind of like brambles and weedy things where those outer layers of forest are going to germinate. So like blackberry is a great successional element to a new forest because it's spiky, it creates amazing soil, and then tree seeds can fall inside the blackberry and grow up and out and eventually shade out the blackberry. So it's obviously not human friendly because it's, the wild blackberry is very spiky, but you can use it to your advantage while you're growing other things. So you could cut a hole out in the middle of the blackberry and potentially have a deer protected fruit tree fence. Or you could train the blackberry up along a fence line so you only have a couple feet where you can harvest the fruit, whereas you don't have 10 feet of spiky bush to get in and out of. So, but edges are also where you can gather surplus material. So if you've ever seen a chain link fence, what's collected on it usually is trash blown in the wind. So it's not a positive example, but it's something you can use in your designs. So you can design in edge, and Jeff Lawton always said if you have a problem designing it properly, just design the edges first, and then the interior kind of takes care of itself. And one of the most productive edges in the natural world is the tropical mangroves, where the rivers and the ocean meet. So you have the brackish water, it's kind of like sort of fresh, sort of salty. You have species that mix in, and then you have, so you're going to have a diversity of species on the edge. So you got only freshwater fish and only saltwater fish, and then you'll have species that only exist in the brackish water, and then some things go back and forth. Just like where a forest and a pasture meet, you'll have birds that only exist in the pasture, you'll have birds that only exist in the forest, and then you'll have some species that exist just in the edge. And then the forest birds might go into the edge, and the pasture birds might go into the edge. So in the edge is where you have the surplus and the extra diversity. That's one of my favorites. It's really a way of changing your perspective and turning a positive into a negative. So instead of fighting nature or fighting problems, we can say, okay, it's not that you have a snail and slug problem, maybe you have a duck deficiency, because ducks love eating snails and slugs. So instead of tearing your hair out to figure out how to get rid of these slugs, you could bring in ducks and then have free eggs. Doesn't mean you necessarily might have an appropriate system for ducks, but it's just a way of thinking about the problem. Whereas another way to look at it is in the Delta, they have a big problem with this aquatic plant called water hyacinth. And mostly why it's so prolific is because of all the agricultural runoff from the farms going into the Delta. So there's all this massive extra nutrient. That's what the water hyacinth is trying to do. It's great at sucking up extra nutrient from the water, but people see, oh, this water hyacinth is causing a problem, so it's ruining the local ecosystem. So maybe you don't have a water hyacinth problem, maybe you have a water buffalo deficiency. Water buffaloes love eating aquatic plants, and they actually have really healthy milk. So instead of us using a lot of energy or seeing it as a problem, maybe we bring in a load of water buffalo and eat all the water hyacinth. Obviously, you need to stop the runoff going into the delta to begin with to stop it being a problem. But anyway, it's just, so it's a way of thinking, a way of reevaluating how you approach the planet. So I will leave you with this. We believe that people are the only critical resource needed by people. So if we organize ourselves together, we are sufficient to each other. And though there's a lot of people currently behaving badly, we actually need as many people behaving in a positive way to fix a lot of the damage that we've created. So, yeah, thank you.